Okay, chapter 11 talks about gender stratification. So, if you were free to do either, would you prefer to have a job outside the home, or would you prefer to stay at home and take care of the house and the family? Here we can see this breakdown by mothers and fathers, and then also working full-time, working part-time, and not working for pay. So when we talk about gender, what do we mean? Gender are personal traits and social positions that members of a society attach to being female or male. So gender, remember, is different from sex, right? Sex is biological. Gender is social and cultural. And the meaning that we've attached to being male or female has changed over time as well. Now, gender stratification refers to the fact that there is an unequal distribution of wealth, money, power, privilege between men and women. So biologically, men and women differ in limited ways. Neither one is naturally superior, but culture can define both of these sexes and therefore both of these genders very differently. So let's think about this globally. In Israel, in a kibbutz, the gender equality is one of its stated goals. Men and women share in both work and decision making, and men and women achieve remarkable, although not complete, social equality. So it's important to remember here that culture defines what is feminine and what is masculine. Now, Margaret Mead, famous female sociologist, said the culture is the key to understanding gender distinctions. So what one society defines as masculine, someone else may define as feminine. And even within our own culture, that changes over time. So I think I mentioned in a previous lecture that things that we consider to be feminine today, right? Like the color pink and dresses and shoes with heels. Those were all initially things reserved for men. So those shoes with heels were for men first. Dresses were for men first. Pink was for men and blue was for girls. You guys might not remember this from your lifetime because it definitely changed, in the last 16 plus years. But you'd go into the toy store, and I can remember taking my niece there when she was little, and she'd say, like, I want to look in the boy toy aisle, right? And Target has changed this today where they don't have color-coded aisles. But even the idea of, like, what kind of toys are appropriate for girls and what kind of toys are appropriate for boys. And how we even change what we call those things, right? So, like, girls play with dolls. Girls have Barbies. And boys have G.I. Joes. G.I. Joes are dolls, but we call them action figures. Now, George Murdoch says that there is some global agreement about feminine and masculine tasks, but basically in his research found that there is a widespread variety of what's considered, predominantly female task and a predominantly male task. So just to kind of sum this part up, feminine and masculine are not consistently defined. They're not consistently defined across cultures. They're not consistently defined in the same culture across time. Gender is too variable to be simply an expression of biology. You guys probably, within this class, we probably have people who identify as feminine, right? Identify as women, and maybe dress more masculine. And maybe sometimes people think, oh, you must want to be a boy, but that's not always the case. Right? And today we have much greater recognition too about people who don't identify one way or another, right? They identify as non-binary. And so just to kind of wrap this up, what it means to be male or female, right, is really a creation of society. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about patriarchy. Patriarchy is a form of social organization in which males dominate females, and this is the majority form. Most countries, most cultures are patriarchal. Matriarchy is a form of social organization in which females dominate males. Now, sexism is the belief that one sex is innately inferior or superior to the other, and then that can be institutionalized. Just like racism can be institutionalized, sexism can be found built into our institutions, okay? So built into schooling and education, built into our economy, built into all kinds of things. So, for instance, you guys probably don't know this because this didn't really happen in your lifetime and you've kind of taken it for granted, but it happened in my lifetime. Granted, I was very young, so I don't remember it. But like women couldn't, like necessarily get a mortgage. They couldn't get a credit card in their own name. Like they needed their husband's permission to have that. They might not have been able to have their own bank account. Those are things that have happened in the lifetime of your grandparents and your parents. Now, sexism has a high price, right? We often think that like there's no cost probably to men for that, but there is. And is it necessary that we live in a patriarchy, right? So gender affects how we think of ourselves. It teaches us how to behave. You guys have probably been told at one point or another by your mom or your grandmom, to act like a lady, right? Or things that we tell young men, right? Like if we see young men crying, we're often like, hey, suck it up, buttercup. And so we also have gender roles then, attitudes and activities that society links to each sex. Things that we expect from men, things we expect from women. So as I mentioned, we do a lot of color coding for gender, right? And this is changing. And I think that it matters less to Gen X and millennial parents than it did maybe to baby boomer parents. We're not as hung up on like, oh, boys, we don't want to, give a boy something pink or dress a boy in something pink. We do generally still have expectations for behavior based on gender, right? So we expect and we raise and socialize girls to be cooperative. We tell them it's okay for them to be emotional, right? So like, we often send the message that it's not okay for boys or men to cry and be emotional, but we'll often tell a young girl who like has fallen and hurt herself, she's not crying, and we'll be like, it's okay, let it all out, right? Women are taught to be polite. Men are really taught to be independent and to take action. So how does this play out with peers, right? So Lever did some research and found that boys tend to favor team sports that have complex rules and clear objectives, and girls tended to play in ways that promoted interpersonal skills of communication and cooperation, right? So think about like little girls that are maybe playing house or some similar game at home, right? Carol Gilligan, who we talked about before, said boys reason according to abstract principles and girls consider morality a matter of responsibility to others. So you might remember we talked about this in a previous chapter, that boys are more justice oriented and girls are often thinking more about how things impact other people. Gender shapes our interests and our beliefs. It guides our choices for careers and choices of study. If you look at your majors, right, you might find some majors are dominated by men, some are dominated by women. I had somebody ask me once, what I did, and I told them that it's a criminal justice professor, and she said, oh, do you have a lot of boys in your program? And I said, no, we're probably 50-50, maybe a few more girls. And she literally asked me, a woman asked me this, if it was possible for the women to be police officers, because how can they do the same things as men? And I just wanted to slap her so hard. I saw a TikTok recently that was showing like a kindergarten workbook from 1976, which happens to be when I went to kindergarten. And it was showing options for girls. And the options were like, do you want to be a mom? Do you want to be a nurse? Do you want to be a teacher? And the idea that like, that's what might have been taught to me, not in my family by any means whatsoever. When I was that age, I was telling people I wanted to be a garbage man because you didn't have to go to college. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around, like, those were still the options we were telling little kids as they went off to school when I went off to school. Now, women are making many gains, right? And we see women in other roles. My niece is 16. When she was young, she used to love to see someone that was in like sort of a flipped stereotypical gender role. So one of the first, maybe second, third time I took her to get her nails done, she was very little. Like she was probably 4. And she got a male nail tech. And at first I was like, ooh, I wonder if she's going to be freaked out. And she thought it was the best thing ever. She told everybody. The person who did her nails was a guy. Okay. She, first time she met like a woman who was a police officer, she really thought that was super cool too. Now, in terms of gender in the mass media, where have we kind of seen the most dominant message there is from white men. Minorities really are locked out of the mass media until the early 1970s, and women were receiving roles based upon like their beauty, how pretty they were, and what their sex appeal was. And advertising really perpetuates this beauty myth. So Naomi Wolf, who talks about this a lot, said that the beauty myth really kind of sends a message to women that it's important to strive to be physically attractive to men, and that that's what will make women happy. That women should measure their worth in terms of their physical appearance, and women should prize relationships with men, and they will attract those men using their looks, their physical appearance. So what about gender and social stratification? Okay, so today in most families, right, both parents are working. It's almost not even possible to work, live in this economy and pay for the things you want and need without both parents working. And so women make up about half of the U.S. paid labor for workforce, and 78% of working women work full time. Okay. But like my Nana, who is the generation before baby boomers, she did not work. She was home raising 5 children. So yeah, she was working, right? But she didn't work outside of the home. My mom did work outside the home. My mom was in nursing school up until I was 2. And so my mom has worked, most of my life. So this common view in the past, right, that like it was men's responsibility to bring in income, that is a view that held for like probably your grandparents' generation. But society really changed, and that changed this view as well, right? So some of the things that played a role here is that cities are growing, family sizes are getting smaller. We have a rising divorce rate. As women, here's a thing that wasn't available to women for a long time either, was divorce. And as women can leave unsafe and unhappy marriages, this provides a lot of freedom, but it also means they have to work. So we do still see some differences in the type of work done by men and women. So women tend to work more in pink collar jobs and in service work, whereas men dominate most other jobs. So there's some fields you guys may be seeing yourself go into. If you are a criminal justice major, you will notice there are a lot of women in our program, but it's still really a male-dominated field. So there's a bunch of police departments that signed on for this thing. I think it's 30 by 30. They want to have 30% of their workforce be women by 2030. And I thought, oh my word, that's it? 30% by 2030? Shouldn't we be close to 50? 50% of the population is women. And I've been to a couple police academy graduations this summer for female grads. And I always count how many women are in the class. And it's usually like, 10, 15%. And there's a ton of police officers present. And the women are vastly outnumbered by the men. And then there's people on the stage who are like people who were instructors in the academy and important invited guests. And I've seen one woman on the stage each time. And she does not work in law enforcement. She works for the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. So how do we keep women out of certain jobs? We just define those as like men's work. I can remember, if you guys are local, you might be familiar with Kelly's, which is on Revere Beach. Kelly's has a bunch of other locations now, but it used to just be on Revere Beach, right? And they only hired men. There were no women working at Kelly's. So like a ton of teenage boys would work there, and they literally had a policy that they did not hire teenage girls. Now, rates of unemployment for men and women rise and fall together. Reasons for unemployment: jobs that are traditionally performed by men have gone overseas, right? So we talked before about how you used to be able to get like a solid, good, skilled position, but they would train you for that skilled position here in the U.S. and you could support your family with that. And those are jobs that all, for the most part, moved overseas. right? Job losses in administrative and support work, those are often jobs covered by women. And so here we see some jobs with the highest concentrations of women, right? Like preschool kindergarten teacher, right? 98% are women. Medical records technician, childcare worker, dental hygienist, dental assistant, hairdresser, cosmetologist, home health aides, right? Secretaries or administrative assistants. Okay, now the median earnings for women working full-time in 2020 is $50,982. So a median means, a median's a better measure for income than averages. An average is going to be really subject to like people who make a ton of money and people who make a small amount of money. For example, Northeastern likes to brag, or they did for a while brag about the average income, the mean income of their CJ grads. But they had a CJ grad who went on to play professional basketball. So it's misleading. You put in like a super high salary like that, right? It makes it shifts your average up and it makes it seem as though the average pay is higher. A median is just as many people make above that as make below that. And for men, it's $61,000. So for every dollar earned by men, women earn 83 cents. Now that decreases significantly. That's white women earn 83 cents. Okay, I think black women earn 60 something cents. So why do women get paid less? Okay, well, first of all, we live in a patriarchy. Okay. Second of all, we've talked a little bit about the type of work that women do, and that work tends to be valued less and paid less, right? So we just saw some of those jobs that are dominated by women, right? Kindergarten teacher. I don't think you know any wealthy kindergarten teachers. Discrimination against women and how society views women. And then on top of that, right, as women enter the workforce, women work what we call a second shift. Women come home and then they're often responsible for managing the household as well, right? And so that's like a second shift of unpaid labor. The share of work done by women at home has remained the same, okay? So that's not decreasing. So women spend about twice as much time working to support the family, right? Making lunches, doing laundry, whatever, as men do. So women have significantly less leisure time. And here we can see kind of a breakdown of who does how much housework, right? So on average, women spend considerably more time doing housework than men. All right, ladies, we are killing it in some arenas. We are 60% of college students. We earn 58% of all bachelor's degrees, okay? And the differences in those men and women's majors have become smaller. The gender gap is disappearing in some professional fields, and education is one social institution where women as opposed to men dominate. Women make up half the Earth's population, but only hold 25% of seats in the world's 193 parliamentary governments. This is a fun and interesting time to be recording this lecture because we have a female candidate for president. She's not our first female candidate, but we have a female candidate for president, and that's been super cool to see. Women have made a lot of political gains, and so we are seeing change at the highest levels of power. Gender also shapes our political attitudes, right? So the things that might be important to a woman politically might be very different from what's important to a man, right? The Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, is much more focused on equality and rights and protections for women than the Republican Party is. And here we can see some firsts for women, right? The first time women are allowed to vote is in Wyoming in 1869. We do see a woman run for president in 1872, right? We kind of see some cool firsts here, right? 1981, guys, that's in my lifetime where we have the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. Geraldine Ferraro is the first woman to run as a vice presidential candidate. I remember this happened too. I was in grade school, just to clarify. It's not like I was, full-grown adult in the 80s. And actually, while she was running as vice president, there was a girl in my class whose last name was Ferraro, and they were related. We see our first Secretary of State in 1996, 2000. We see the first a former First Lady be elected to political office, right? And you can see we've got lots of things here, right? So in your lifetime, you've seen Kamala Harris become the first female vice president. And we see the first female, black female on the U.S. Supreme Court in the last couple of years. And of course, we have Kamala Harris running for president right now. And here we can kind of see a breakdown, right, of the percentage by state of legislators who are women, right? So you can see Massachusetts, we're doing a decent job here, right? But still, women are 50% of the population. Now, the military, this is also something that's changed in my lifetime. So while women have been involved in combat to some degree or another, generally speaking, women were barred from combat. So like if I had wanted to join the military at the age at which young people join the military, I would not have been eligible to go to combat. But the share of women in forward serving units has increased dramatically. So pretty much all positions in the military are open to men and women. Now, what are some arguments around this? Some people sort of feel like, how do we send our women off to war? Like that feels icky, right? And that how do we ask women to kill when we believe that women should be like nurturing and caring and loving? Some people say women lack physical strength. When I was in college and in grad school the first time, I lived out by a military base, so I know at the time, knew a ton of people that were in the military. And honest to God, the biggest badass I knew was this teeny tiny little woman. So are women a minority? You might think no, because you might think a minority meaning like small group, right? And women are half the population. But a minority is a category of people that are distinguished by physical or cultural differences. And we have set that group apart and subordinated them. Okay. And you might also think like, yeah, things aren't super bad for women here in the US, but they're not super great either. Okay. Looking at power structures, women are a minority, despite the fact that we outnumber men by a teeny tiny bit. And of course, a major issue for women is violence against women, right? So in the 19th century, 1800s, men claimed the right to physically discipline their wives. You guys might be familiar with the phrase as a rule of thumb. Okay, that comes from this idea that men could beat their wife with a stick so long as it wasn't thicker than their thumb. That's where the rule of thumb comes from. Okay. So when we think about masculinity in our culture, right, violence is tied up in some of that. Gender violence is an important issue on college and university campuses. Unfortunately, my college friends, you guys are the highest risk group for sexual assaults. Gender-linked violence also occurs in the home. It occurs in casual and in dating relationships, right? It occurs on campuses. And then also in some other countries, right? So not here, we don't really do this here, but female genital mutilation is performed in more than 24 countries. Okay, and here we can see places where that happens. So the orange countries are where it's a very widespread practice. The red ones are like, hey, it happens here in certain communities. And then, I mean, I guess we do have it within some communities here, right? Our culture really defines masculinity in terms of aggression. Men's lives involve more stress and social isolation than women's lives. I would argue that's not necessarily true, that men and women maybe experience different types of stress. But violence is not just a matter of choices, it's cultural as well, right? So like, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the term rape culture, right? Cultures can encourage or discourage certain types of behavior. Now, sexual harassment refers to comments, gestures, physical contact of a sexual nature that is deliberate, repeated, and unwelcome. And this is much more often directed at women. Sometimes it's obvious and direct, but a lot of times it's subtle. People do it in a way where then they're like, I was just joking, right? Or it's just locker room talk. Now, also when we think about gender, a thing that we might think about, and we'll talk, we might have already talked about this in another chapter, is pornography. That's sexually explicit material that causes sexual arousal. I just want to add a little caveat here because for a long time we used the term child pornography, pornography that involved children. And today they discourage using that word. This is a very new change because, again, pornography implies some consent and children cannot consent, right? So if we're talking about that, we refer to it as child sexual abuse materials. Traditionally, we think of pornography as a moral issue. This is another great example of things that have changed over time. So when I was your age, right, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have like easy access to information. And so pornography was something like you bought from a catalog that you hid in your house, or you went to like a dirty bookstore for. And maybe your video rental place carried X-rated titles, but they were like in a separate room. And so like when I was growing up, we had much less exposure to pornography than you do today, right? Today, like you just have to hop on the internet. You can find it accidentally as well. So fun fact, the web address of the White House is whitehouse.gov, but whitehouse.com is what a lot of people might think it is. Whitehouse.com is a pornography site. Pornography plays a role in gender stratification. People are concerned, like, does it encourage violence against women? I think it sort of depends on the type of pornography you're looking at. And certainly people who are interested in violence against women are going to be drawn to pornography that, pictures and shows violence against women. All right, so let's look at our 3 paradigms and let's think about them in terms of gender. So structural functional theory says that gender forms a complementary set of roles and it guides our process of socialization, right? So that's like a function that it serves in our society, right? Gender helps parents, school, everywhere socialize us. Even super open-minded parents, right? Like it is still guiding some of how you look at things and some of how you judge things. This approach assumes, though, that there's a singular view of society. I think that this, as I mentioned before, is really changing over time with people kind of being less hung up on like, hey, if boys want to wear skirts and makeup, like, great, good for them. We're even seeing like, major advertising campaigns that are men that are wearing makeup. This also ignores the strain and social costs of rigid gender roles. And if you say that like, oh, this serves a function that helps our society, it might also then really be pro-male domination of women. Now, symbolic interaction theory, right, is looking at how we make meaning and how we interpret things that we experience, right? So in everyday life, women are expected to be more deferential. Let's think about women sitting somewhere in public, whether that's on the train, whether it's on a bench, whatever, right? Women are often kind of like, if you take the T, you know this, right? Men will man spread, right? Their legs are spread out. They often kind of encroach in the space of the people next to them, and women kind of like squish in, right? Men are much more in people's personal space, and women generally aren't, right? So gender shapes our experiences in our everyday life. It shapes how we see things. It shapes how people react to us, right? And so this perspective is telling us how gender shapes our everyday experiences. But that's not really going to look at broad patterns of inequality. That's going to be looking at things on more of an individual level. Now, social conflict theory is going to talk about how does gender relate to inequality, right? So capitalism really strengthens men's power, and gender obviously involves differences in power. Guys, you can see this in meetings too. As you guys get into professional roles, you'll see in some meetings where like some men will just talk over women, interrupt them, no regard for it. Sometimes, that behavior gets excused. People don't look at it twice. If men are opinionated and vocal about their opinions, that's often applauded. When women do it, we're often called like bitchy or unfriendly. So this perspective is going to be strongly critical of conventional ideas of gender, but at the cost of ignoring that men and women do cooperate. And while we have these criticisms of every one of these institutions we're talking about this semester, that doesn't mean like, please don't ever mistake this for a blanket of like all men are, because that's just not the case. Now, perhaps you've heard of the term intersectionality, right? intersection theory is really looking at how do different dimensions of our demographics, and in particular things that might disadvantage us, how do they interact together, right? So race, class, gender, right? How, if you are, so here's the thing to think about, right? Women more disadvantaged than men. White women, though, sometimes it's hard for us to see how we might be disadvantaged, right? It's hard for white people to see how they're advantaged. Right? It's hard for us to see that, to see how our privilege benefits us, right? So what happens then if you are a woman and you're black? So now you've got multiple dimensions of inequality. Now what happens if you're gay? What happens if you're also non-binary, right? How do those things, and you're poor, how do those things play in together? And is it just an additive effect, or is it more multiplicative? Right? So women are differentially disadvantaged based on other things that, other demographics that we might belong to. Now, feminism, as I mentioned before, some people think of this as like a dirty word. Some people assume it means you hate men, and it does not. Gentlemen, you should all be feminists as well, because feminism just means that you believe men and women should be treated equally. Okay? It's social equality. And there's been several waves of feminism and what they've argued for. The first way, and again, you could take a whole course on this, guys. But the first wave begins in the 1840s, the second wave in the 60s, and then we still have a wave continuing today. But what do feminists want? We want equality. We want to expand human choice. We want you to stay the heck away from our bodies without our consent. Okay? Don't regulate my uterus, please. They want to eliminate gender stratification, end sexual violence, and promote sexual freedom. Okay? Those are all things that men should be pro these ideas as well. Okay. So here's another fun fact you might not have known, that until the late 1900s, before I was born, but in my parents' lifetime, there were states that banned contraception, and then even the early Supreme Court rulings on this said that like married couples can have access to contraception, but not single people, right? But in the U.S., most married women of childbearing age are using contraception, right? But in lower income countries, a lot of people don't have access to this. Okay, so types of feminism. There's liberal feminism, which is individuals should be free to develop their own talents and pursue their own interests, right? And by the way, feminism includes, if you're a woman who says, I would like to be married and I would like to be able to be a stay-at-home mom and take care of the household and take care of my children, that is feminist as well, okay? And feminists support your right or your decision to do that. Socialist feminism says the family form has to change. There needs to be some collective means of carrying out housework and childcare. And radical feminism is really seeking like a gender-free society. So the Democratic Party provides the greatest support for feminism. If you look at what's been happening politically in the last few years, you'll see that it's been the Republican Party's really been pushing for all these laws. They're behind the the partial overturning of Roe v. Wade, these abortion bans, wanting to regulate women's bodies. The Democratic Party is pro-choice. By the way, being pro-choice does not mean pro-abortion. You can say, I would never want an abortion, but I wouldn't tell someone else what to do. That's pro-choice, right? That choice includes the choice to continue a pregnancy, the choice to have a baby. There's more support, for liberal feminism than there is for the other two forms of feminism. So looking ahead, there's been a lot of change. There's been a ton of change in my lifetime. We're also sort of, the pendulum is swinging backwards, and we're really sort of going backwards in some ways too. What are some things that have played a role in this, like over centuries? Industrial revolution, computer technology, right? And social change involving gender in the 21st century. Maybe it'll be just as great.